Welcome to another episode of the Group Dynamic Podcast. My name is Juergen and I'm one host of the podcast. Today I'm talking to David Jamieson. And David is the president of the NTL, the National Training Laboratories, and a retired professor of various OD programs. He's also a past national president of the American Society for Training and Development, now called ATD, and past chair of the Management Consultation Division and Practice Theme Committee of the Academy of Management. So we have someone very interesting to listen to today, and I have the pleasure to be talking to Dave. And during the next 50 minutes, we are talking about use of self, a very interesting, very complex, and sometimes, at least for me, intimidating topic. But after the next 50 minutes, you will realize that it is not so difficult and that you can start quite easily by just being aware of things that are triggering you, probably emotionally, and then hold, sit back, reflect, and think about your choices, choice points, possible choices that you can do. Don't put yourself under stress if it's a bit complex. It's a lifelong journey, as Dave says. Now enjoy this part of the podcast. All right, Dave, welcome. It's great to see you, to hear you, and talk about this fantastic topic, the use of self. Mm-hmm. And we will probably get back to the question, how will I do that? But I think in the beginning, what is use of self? What is myself besides me being Juergen?
Well, there's a couple ways to think about it. The most important aspect, I think, is it's how do we understand our whole being? That is, all of our best characteristics, our best efforts, our best skills, and the things that are triggers for us or get in the way or cause us difficulty. And so it's how do I understand my whole being? And then how do I use that to execute the intentions of my role? So let's say we're talking about a professional role, like a change agent or a leader, or you can even apply it to being a father or a mother, because it's the intention of your role and how you use yourself to execute that. And it involves understanding the situations that we're in. So, we go from one meeting to another meeting, or we go from one community to another community. How do we take in data so that we're trying to relate our intentions to that particular situation? And I call it a social situation generally, because there's other people involved. And then how we actually make decisions to behave, or to say something or not say something, or to stay or to leave. And so all of these things we sort of take for granted, because as we grow up, we learn a whole bunch of things through our parents and through our schools and through our communities that guide the behaviors that we live when we're adults. And what we want to do with use of self is give people the understanding that the more they understand themselves, the more choices they actually have in terms of how they execute their roles. So that's what use of self is really about.
When you say it, it sounds so easy.
Not easy.
If I think about, you mentioned roles, if I think about the many multiple roles that I have, plus the role transitions that I'm going through, it sounds tremendously difficult to see these things, to experience them.
Yes, it can be, because we do have multiple roles. But think about it in terms of a specific role and various situations that we're in. So when I've been teaching people, I've been either teaching change agents or leaders. If I wanted to do a parenting class, I could apply the same principles, only each of the people there would be focused on a different role, is all. And so in our own lives, we try to figure out what's most important to us. Where am I having success, or where do I need improvement? That's probably where I would speak in my focuses on use of self, is where I could be better.
When we talk about roles, leadership roles, for example, I have constant discussions with people, what is a good leader? So roles seem to be a fantasy in many cases. People put in their fantasies what a good leader should be like, a good change agent should be like.
Right.
Isn't this interpretation, this fantasy of the role impacting how I use myself?
Yes, absolutely. Because we're influenced by theory and we're influenced by influence. And we're also influenced by the systems that we're in. The people we most listen to are influencing us. So if we're in a particular corporation with a particular culture, then we are going to learn their version of what a good leader is. And it may not be the same if we go to another company. So when I say your personal intention, I want not just what the company says, it's what do you believe you should be doing as a leader? What makes you your best leader? So the person needs to put their 2 cents into it or their point of view into those decisions, I think.
But ultimately, it could happen that I put myself into the role and try to match that with the demands of the organization, and we don't match.
That's right. That can happen. That can happen, yeah. This is what I call fit, when people work in places where they have to kind of bend themselves all the time to make it work there. That's not a healthy situation for the individual. Yeah. And so we do that because we want to keep the job or we want to work for that company. But the fit part is, who am I and what is this organization demanding of me? That's where the fit needs to occur. And the same thing is true of consultants who work with multiple organizations, and they find some of them they fit in well, and some of them they just run up against resistance constantly. In some ways, they're not able to intervene themselves into that system. And the system is rejecting them too much. And so they're not a good fit as a consultant in those situations.
If we talk about an employee, because the consultants, maybe he or she can leave and just go work with another client. Yes. But if I think about an employee and the best self, becoming a best version of yourself, I'm wondering if I, as an employee, have the chance to decide that, or if I have to submit myself to the organization and they decide what my best self is going to be, and I simply have to adapt. Otherwise, I'm getting expelled from the system.
I think that is a challenge, and I think it's a real challenge, and most people often don't deal with their side of that discussion, meaning that they let go of their intention and their desires in order to live in that organization. Psychologically and physically, that is not healthy over a career. So what I often do with use of self is try to help people remember that you always have choices. And there are always better environments for all of us. We don't always know where they are, but there are better environments for us. And it doesn't mean we should hop around. But this is why if we do a better job at the education level, and if we do a better job when people are starting their careers, we would help people find the right environments, the right situations, and the ways where their best self can come out. Because part of what we manage at any given time is we manage our strengths and we manage our undeveloped sides all the time. So if they want person A to lead a team and hold meetings with the team, and that person is scared to death to lead, they're going to have trouble with that role. But that may be a beautiful thing for them to develop. That may be a beautiful way for them to develop that leadership side of themselves.
When I listen to you, and I have constantly coming up a couple of things that I'm very skilled at probably, and things I'm not very skilled at. And I'm wondering if I have to become the best version of myself, I immediately feel a lot of burden that is being put onto my shoulders, maybe by myself.
Yes.
Isn't this stressing people out if they have to develop in these areas or have to learn this and that all the time?
I think it can when they don't know how to develop themselves. That is, how to use the learning cycle, meaning that every situation they're in provides them with feedback if they keep their eyes and their ears open, right? Now, a lot of times we're in a hurry. We do things, we don't learn from them. If you know what I mean. So part of what I would try to do is say every situation is an opportunity to learn something about myself and how I impact and land on other people, and how well what I wanted to do, whether it was executed or not. So part of it is I don't worry about whether I did perfect every minute of every day. I worry if I'm not learning from my experiences every day. I don't want to have extra stress. I don't want to have extra burden, but I may find that there's a part of myself that is coming out in some groups because I am triggered emotionally by people in that group. And if I understand that, then I have a little bit more control and a little bit more choice of how I behave. If I don't understand it, I will tend to react. All right?
I would totally agree to that. But if I now think about a couple of leaders, and I think the timing, the hectic in daily business, that's definitely one crucial point. So for me, the question is, do we allow ourselves time to breathe in daily business and to really think about what's going on? But isn't that also a very high demand of people who are getting technically trained? I'm sitting at a university, technical university, and usually we don't have these type of offerings in the curricula.
That's right. I wish we did. I really wish we did. I've brought them to some MBA programs, and I've brought them to most every organization development program that I've had a part in. I mean, because each one of us is a different journey. Each one of us needs a different journey to develop our best self and to use our best self. And you're right. In the workplace, we're not helping people at all. We're asking people to do more and do it faster.
Yeah.
One of the things that gets lost in that is something we call the reflective pause, meaning that is, after experiences, we need to have a reflective pause, even if it's going home at night or spending 5 minutes in our office by ourselves or something. Anything that works for somebody to say, what happened in that last situation? What can I learn from that? And then let me move on to the next one. Because what that does is it actually helps to embed it in our mind as opposed to just letting it fly by. Sometimes when people are moving so fast, they never do the reflective pause. Well, the reflective pause is the way in which we take in information that allows us to change.
I'm just thinking about daily stand-ups or weeklies or recaps that seem to be very popular in startups here in Berlin. They're doing this constantly. But when I hear you talking, they seem to be, in comparison, these stand-ups and recaps seem to be very functional, focused on the product, on the outcome, and not on the process, especially not on the individual.
That's right. And remember that it's up to us to pay attention to ourselves, because the organization is not going to do that. The organization is not going to be worried about how you're doing and whether you're your best self, other than the fact that if they don't like what you do, they may not want to keep you. That's all. The main thing here is there's not a right answer. There's not one way to do it, but there are significant pieces that we work on. We work on understanding who we are. We work on the clarity of our intention. We work on how to show up and be present so that we are in that system at the moment. Because when our mind is in the last system, we're not present in this system, right? So for leaders who have very busy schedules, they have to pay attention to that. And a lot of leaders could be a lot better, I think, the ones I've worked with, hundreds of that I've worked with. A lot of them aren't that good because they're only task-oriented. They're losing their connection to people. And so they get paid well and they get valued for the performance they conduct. But the people who have to put up with them every day may not be happy. Again, use of self can have a big impact when it's done well.
If I use myself, for example, and we probably talk about self-awareness as one crucial thing in use of self. When I came into this room, there were 2 students in the room, and I had to kick them out, which was not very nice. So I, let's say, regressed into my role as a professor, and I used my power that I have over the students. So I basically used force, more or less. I used my position power. But if I reflect that, I feel shame. And it took quite a couple of years to embrace this shame. And someone I really appreciate, he said, it's the shame of learning. So if I, as a leader, take some time, think about myself, think about my behaviors and how I show up in role,
Yeah.
I might feel shame because I've learned something. So learning is linked to something that is very bad because I was ashamed when my mother scolded me and all these type of
Yes,
things,
exactly.
for example. So
Exactly.
do we have to accept this shame? Can we transfer it into something better? You know what I mean?
Yes, I think there's a couple of choices in that. Number one is when you came into the room and you knew you had to get the students out of there, the first pause for you is what choices could I use that would have them leave? Some will produce shame. Some might not produce shame. That's the word, that's where the word personal choice comes in. And so if you had found another way to say something to them and they grabbed whatever they had with them and they left and you didn't feel shamed. But if you had to use force or authority, then maybe that's what you thought was the best choice at the time. So how we learn about those choices is part of that learning, that pausing to learn and reflective pause kind of thing, because when we're in a situation, we sometimes don't see any choices. We act in the way that we've always acted. We don't see the choices. When we do, then we can make a different choice on how we behave. And I've worked on myself for decades now. And I mean, it's never done. It's never done because tomorrow I'll be in a meeting and I'll get a little bit emotional and I'll say something that I wished I hadn't said. But at least I'm very sensitive now to learn from that. So what triggered me is the first thing I learned. The second thing is what choices did I not see that I could have done? And you do that in cycles. You do that in iterative cycles. It's amazing how much wiser we all get about how we bring ourselves to our work.
But if I think about personality, and that was something that you mentioned as well, so I'm probably the type of person who now feels a bit bad about having used authority to kick people out of the room. But if I would be another type of personality, probably I would have enjoyed it.
You would enjoy it, exactly.
Because it feels very self-efficient to use authority and decide these things and order people around.
That's right.
So can you use yourself for good, and obviously you can also use it for bad.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, suppose you're very, very intelligent. So that means you're smart enough to figure out a lot of ways to do things. But your personality factors may be very harmful to others. You may get joy out of making others suffer. And then if you're that smart, you'll figure out dozens of ways to do that to people. So when we talk about the self, for example, think about the self. The self is made up of a lot of different elements. So when we say build self-awareness, it's not just know what your style is or know what your instrument says or what your personality type is. That those are all important, but they're only part of the story. The other part of the story is what's my knowledge and skill sets? But another part is what are my traits and characteristics as a person? Do people say about me, he's hard to understand? Or do they say, he is easy to work with? Those are characteristics that other people pick up. And we also have our emotional side. Every one of us is an emotional being. And how we understand our emotions and how we manage them is very different across the population. And then finally, we have identities. That is what social identities we have, what cultural identities we have. So a lot of our behavior is driven through our identities and our cultures. And when we understand that and we go to another country or we go to another organization, we have to recognize when that's going to be acceptable and when it's not.
That sounds extremely complex, and we probably talk about how I can start this journey that will never end,
That's
like
right.
you said.
That's right. It's a lifelong journey, and it is complex when you put it all on paper, but you don't work on it all the time. In other words, you work on parts of it at different times. So what we do with people a lot is we get them started off with answering a number of questions to themselves in private. We call it honest self-assessment, the one we do only with ourselves. And then when they've done that, we try to get people paired up with somebody, that's either a stranger or somebody they know and trust. Not their boss, not their life partner or something, but somebody who they can talk to. Because as soon as you do your own self-awareness, you need to test it with somebody else who sees you. And that conversation is usually what gets people started, because they identify one, maybe two things or three things that become ahas for them. Say, oh, I really never thought about it that way, or I never knew that you were experiencing me that way. So because of that, that gives me a target to start working on. Don't rate yourself every day. Just try different things. So there's this person in a group that you always seem to get in conflict with. Think about some options of what you could do in the next meeting you have with that person and try them out. So what happens is people work on one thing for a while, and I've watched people overcome many things that they used to not like about how they behaved. And then they move to something else. Then they say, well, now I've just changed my job, and my new job is asking me to do things that are hard for me. So now I got something new to work on. And that's the easiest way to manage it.
For me, what is still resonating with me is the trigger. So something has to happen, and I have to realize that I was triggered for whatever reason, and then work with that a couple of times.
And this, what I call trusted partner concept, is very simple. It doesn't have to be a therapist or a psychologist. It has to be a person who sees how we behave, and we trust them. We listen to them, and we do our own assessment. And in talking it through with somebody else, we get new insights. When I went to graduate school years ago, there was a faculty member who had written a monograph called "It Takes Two to See One." That is something I've now built into all of my use of self work, because what it meant was, it said, if I can't share with other people who I am, then they will have to guess who I am. That's one half. The other half is, if I don't get feedback from people who see me behave, then I'll never know for sure what my impact really is. So the takes two to see one is a really easy thing to live with, because as I've moved between organizations and as I've moved between different stages of my career, I seek out other people who I know can be trusted advisors for me. And after a month or two, I say, tell me what you saw when we were all in that meeting. Tell me what you saw about how I spoke up. And then I learned something.
That's interesting. For me, I learn, when you say trusted advisor, for me, strangers, for example, if I'm sitting in an HI lab or in a similar T group or something like that, I often listen and learn to strangers that I will not see afterwards anymore.
That's right.
Because I trust that a relationship cannot be harmed that much. If I would do this in my organization, probably I would be more afraid that a relationship is being harmed.
See, part of what I say is try not to use the people you work with every day as a trusted advisor, but look for somebody who sees what you do, who knows you. Maybe they're outside of your company. But the point is, when I say trusted advisor, it's someone you have no doubt that they don't have another agenda for you. They are trying to help you. That's all you need, because that opens up our ability to speak.
Which is probably very difficult to find someone who's working closely with you without your own agenda. It sounds to me like my boss hopefully would do that in the best case.
I know. Well, if people understand these concepts better, if we get it spread around better, then leaders could be very helpful to people that work for them, or peers that work with each other could be very helpful to each other. But we have to open up the space where people are psychologically safe and they can be free to talk with each other. And the purpose is always to improve what we're doing. The purpose is not to hurt anybody. It's always to improve what we're doing. There's a lot of ways that you can do this. I was just reading somebody's article that was written back in 1985, and I had forgotten all about it. And they sent it to me recently, and I just finished reading it, and it has a dozen different ways that help to talk about use of self. But it was done so long ago, it wasn't talked about as a use of self article. But when I'm looking at it today in 2022, I'm looking back at it and saying, wow, that was really powerful that long ago to be able to say some of those things. I have a mentality now to think in use of self terms. So every time I'm reading stuff, I can see different things happening. And then when I go into teaching or consulting, I'm already thinking about things that are going on inside of me as I'm walking in the door. Because I know if I'm not in good shape, I'm not going to show up very well.
So that would be another question. If I realize that I'm not in good shape, I shouldn't use myself that day, probably for whatever reasons, because I have stress at home or whatever. Would the suggestion be, don't use yourself, don't go into this meeting, don't show up?
No. You can show up and just make different choices. For example, you might decide to participate less today if you're not feeling well. Or you might tell a friend of yours that you've got a couple other things on your mind today, so you don't want to take the lead in the meeting. That's all. You want to just shift. You don't have to be absent. You can just shift what you're doing.
I instantly remember a couple of situations with my students when we do these, we call them interpersonal dynamics classes, similar to the HI lab.
Yep.
There is often a discussion between those who are more vocal in the meetings and those who are more quiet. And for me, it's a choice whether you be vocal or you be quiet.
Yes,
but
it
very
is
often,
a choice. Yes.
there comes judgment into that. So those who are vocal, these are the good ones, and those who are quiet, these are the bad ones. So, I mean, if I make the choice not to participate that much, it can probably seen from the organizational perspective or from my boss's perspective as he's not a good fit.
Well, and part of that becomes organization culture driven. You know, in the Myers-Briggs, there's the introvert, extrovert, the I and the E part of Myers-Briggs instruments. What they tell you is a piece of your personality about being more extroverted, meaning you are outward bound and you are used to speaking up and you are used to talking a lot, or internal, which means you're more focused on what's going on in your own mind. You're cycling a lot of stuff. You think more than while others are speaking more. And so those characteristics do, in fact, make different styles. Now, the culture of the organization can value both of those or not value both of those. And that's where that evaluation starts to come in.
I also sometimes realize that if people are opening up, and for myself, that's also true. So if I try to be aware of myself, if I try to use myself and then tell people, look, at the moment I'm feeling like this, I probably make a choice to participate less or do this or that. Sometimes I have the impression that people are not annoyed, but surprised that I share such personal things in a professional environment. And at times it seems to be reasonable not to share that much about yourself, because it creates an awkward situation.
That's true. That's also organization culture based. For example, leave your personal self at home and come to work as a professional. What that's asking people to do is to keep dividing themselves. There's a great book called The Divided Self, written by Parker Palmer. And he says that the society creates a lot of divides for us. And so we become multiple people inside the same skin. What we want to try to do over our lifetime is become more integrated and whole as best we can. So sometimes when we see a person who's very successful, very well liked, has great impact on people, one of the things I would say look at is whether or not they are acting as one whole person most of the time. Many of us don't always get that choice early in our career because we're kind of told to follow these cultural norms and act this way when you're at work and act this way when you're at home. And I don't mean that they have to be identical at all. I just mean that the more divided they get, the more of our energy goes into figuring out which persona we are working in. So a lot of energy goes into that. When we can be roughly the same person, and it took me 30, 40 years to be pretty much the same in most situations now, is I don't have to stop and think, which mask should I be putting on as I walk through this door? Instead, I have my regular self, and that's who's walking through most of the doors. Now, if I'm going to a situation where I'm going to be nervous, that's okay. I know that, and I pay attention to it as I walk through that door. That's all.
But that probably would require you to choose your jobs wisely, I would think. I remember a situation when my father came home, and he was a very successful manager at that time. And I told him, stop managing us. You are not at work.
That's right. That's right.
So I wanted him to separate the two personas, but it was impossible, I would say, to just keep one persona, because he would either fail at home or at work.
That's right. That's right.
So probably people should pick jobs where they can be the same. Is that true?
Well, it's not being the same identically. Think about home and work as two different situations. I can still be the same person where I have intention in my role. I have choices I can make. I assess what's going on. I assess, oh, this is my wife and this is my kids here. That I take in that data, and it triggers in me all the kinds of things I want to do through that role. I'm at work and I have to manage some people. If my intention is to do that, then what I'm doing is I'm taking in data that's telling me when should I do it, how should I do it, how often should I do it? I'm taking in that data and making those choices.
So again, it's about choice points. And maybe the question, do I feel comfortable with the choices I have to make to be proficient in the role I'm now playing?
Exactly. And one of the things I learned from my students was how many people would look at a situation and say, I have one reaction in my head, I don't see any other choices. And I thought, okay, that teaches me about the sense of not having freedom. That is, when we don't see choices, then we only can act habitually. That's all we have available to us.
And then we come back to timing and stress at the workplace, because under stress, people often regress and they fall back to behavior they know, and then they do not consciously choose things. I'm wondering, in Germany, we had, I don't know, decades ago, it seems like we had a movement about group dynamics. So people were sitting in T groups and they were dealing with themselves and doing all these self-awareness things. For whatever reason, it seemed to have become unpopular. And I think OHI Labs, it's similar. I don't know many people who are doing these type of things. Do you have a fantasy why it has become unpopular?
I know. I feel the same way. There was a time when it was more popular, and I think more people went to them, and then they told their friends. I think there's been fewer people going for the last 10 or 20 years, probably fewer people going to these. There's not a word of mouth spreading around. And in fact, at NTL, I mean, I'm trying to talk to the people who run our labs and think about, what do we need to say to the populations today who don't have history with that? What do we need to say to them, and how it can help them? What is the way that it supports human development? What is the way that it helps them do better at their jobs and stuff like that? We're not getting that information out, because that was all written about 40 years ago. No one's reading that now. So I think we need some new messaging.
The other idea that I have, the other fantasy, is that very often I talk to people, they have made a bad experience, or not a bad experience. Let's say they have made a very emotional experience.
Yes.
It seems like people don't like these emotional
Nobody
experiences.
likes it. That's right.
I think it's a pity, because especially nowadays, we should deal with these topics, but at the same time, it seems like we tend to avoid looking at ourselves.
Oh, I know.
And also discovering the shadow side.
That's right.
And how to deal with this side, probably. You mentioned this shadow
yes.
a bit earlier, but how to deal with that, with your negative aspects?
Well, I mean, One of the really interesting things about the shadow work is it's not all negative. What actually gets placed in the shadow are things that we disown, that we do not want to have as part of ourselves. Now, sometimes as children, we learned that from somebody else. We didn't make that decision. But as an adult, we find out later that we hold very tightly to things that we don't want to have show up. Sometimes they are bad behaviors, but sometimes they are skill sets that nobody else supported. I've worked with many, many women in courses who act shy and are afraid to take the lead, even in a small group. In further conversations with a lot of them, they would say, every time I would try to speak up or take charge of something, people in my family would put me down, people in my school would put me down, etc. And so over time, I don't think that's something I should be doing. So I've buried it in my shadow. And then they find out about it and they test it a little bit. And guess what? They become leaders and they do a good job. But they had to let go of that piece being buried in their shadow. That's all. And it also could be things where people made a mistake or they did a crime when they were a kid and they don't ever want it to show up and they never want to speak about it or anything. Part of it is understanding who we are means understanding our shadow as well. So if we're aware of it, what we do is we watch for situations that could trigger it, that might bring it back to us. And we try to manage that as best we can.
And probably not leaving it in the shadow, but trying to shed some light on it. And
exactly.
For me, very often it's helpful to simply be able to put a label onto something.
Exactly.
So to pull it out of the unconsciousness, put a label on it, and then it's easier to deal with it.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And we all have those. It's just a matter of whether we can be honest with ourselves or get feedback from others that we trust. And they say, oh, okay, yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes I get emotional about that, or I get triggered by that, or I sometimes am a very calm person in a meeting, and then all of a sudden I'm not. And I'm glad you noticed that, because if you noticed that, then I need to understand what it was that was happening in me that did that. And there's your self-learning right there. That is the self-learning process.
Maybe at the end, Dave, learning these type of things, the continuous action learning cycles. You briefly mentioned in the beginning that we have to observe things, that we have to take them in, to take time to reflect them.
That's correct.
Can you talk a little bit about this action learning cycle and how to use them to develop or use?
Yes, absolutely. We call it an action learning cycle because it happens multiple times a day. And I think about it as every situation that we have to execute something in. That is, we are in a situation and we have to play out our role in some way. So we go in and we take in data. And the question we're asking is, what's going on here? Who's here and what's going on here, right? Now, we use our senses, we take in data. The next thing we do, we be very clear about what is my role here? What is my purpose here? What are we doing in this situation? And I get very specific about situational focus, not generic, I'm the leader. So now I have what's going on here, and I have a clear sense of what my intention of my role is. I then look for choices. When I'm listening, when I have a choice of speaking up or not speaking up, which ones do I choose and why? And then I take an action, and something will happen in the meeting. People will respond to it very positively, or people will shut up and say nothing. Those are both very important pieces of feedback. So I take that in, but nobody gave me feedback. The meeting is over. I walk down the hall. When I'm walking down the hall, my job is reflective practice. That is, think through what happened and what could I have done differently. And who might I ask if I want to get clear feedback? Right? So that's the cycle. Now, the cycle's done with a reflective activity that allows us to embed something in our brain, and off we go into the next situation. But that's the cycle, and they happen over and over and over again. And today, because I have a new job, I'm moving into meetings and groups that I've never met before. And every time I'm using that cycle because I have to decide how I'm going to show up. What's my role going to be here?
Again, what comes into my mind is a student who recently said, we were just sitting there, just thinking, reflecting. And it came the notion of, this is a waste of time because we're not doing anything. We're just sitting. And I was like, interesting. That sitting, reflecting is considered a waste of time because people think we're not ticking a box, we're not achieving something.
I know.
And this fear of missing out something, that's quite interesting. That seems to sneak in and prevent this reflection at times.
Exactly. And all of our societies, I think, and even in our two countries, are so task-oriented. They're unbelievable. Which means doing is always outweighs everything else. And the problem is, without thinking and pausing once in a while, we do a lot of things that are not done well and that have to be redone later. And the reflective part is not spending hours. I'm saying as an individual, I want a dozen reflective pauses a day. I want short things, something that I'm taking in quickly, and then I'm moving on. That's my part of it. If I want to sit and talk with people about it, that's another form of reflection. It's not personal, it's reflection with others. And that can take a little longer, but that's more about being and learning than it is about doing. And that's fine. I mean, but we have to accept that that's okay.
Interesting topic. I think, like you said, a tremendous amount of work ahead of each of us. So thank you for sharing these thoughts and providing the opportunity for me to reflect a little bit about the students and how I used myself.
Perfect.
Probably doing a couple of other choices.
I think that's good because it's about life and it's about how we show up the best. So think about life and showing up. People don't think about it. They build a routine and they show up in their routine. And all I'm saying is situation to situation, we may take in different data and make different choices. That's what I want people to learn how to do.
Especially these trigger things. Triggers for me are a phenomenal thing. To me, it's always like a needle someone is putting into me and it hurts. And one way is to pull out the needle, throw it away. And the other one is to hold the needle and look at the thread that is connected to it, because that will lead you to something that is kind of a discovery.
That's a great way to put it. No, that's absolutely right, because triggers, for the most part, are emotional memories that someone or something is triggering in us. And some are negative and some can even be positive. Like we can even remember a very positive event when we walk into somebody else's event and we say, this reminds me of my 12th birthday. Oh, wow, that was wonderful, you know? So the emotional side is very active in most of our triggering. And sometimes it's fearful because it raises a negative emotion. And so then it's more fearful. But it could go either way is important. How we react to that is the main question here. Because if I don't think, then I will probably react in a way that I'll be sorry for later. That's the reason.
Dave, thank you again very much for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This was a great conversation, and I appreciate you creating this.
This was another episode of the Group Dynamic Podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward very much to hear you next time.